Since the 19th century, people have talked about a difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And the idea roughly is that the Christ of faith is the Jesus Christians believe in, the Jesus we find in the Gospels in the New Testament. The Jesus of history is supposed to be the Jesus that historians can find for us by digging back behind the Gospels and presenting, as it were, a figure who's different from the Gospels. And so we have a long history of people reconstructing the historical Jesus. And the way you can tell, I think, that that's a fruitless quest is that they're all different, constantly getting different reconstructions of the historical Jesus. It depends on people's judgments as to what's authentic and so on, and all kinds of subjective factors. You come out with a whole lot of different Jesuses, so the method clearly doesn't work very well. I think the distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith is one that has actually collapsed in the best recent study of the Gospels. The kind of work that shows that the Gospels are actually quite close to eyewitness testimony. So that what I think we can say we have in the Gospels is not the Christ of faith as distinct from the Jesus of history, but rather what I call the Jesus of testimony.
Did Jesus really exist? If so, what can we know about him historically? For any Christian, the historicity of Jesus isn't merely a matter of curiosity. The Christian faith is dependent upon the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus as historical reality. But how can we know if the Jesus of the Gospels is historical or legendary?
How much we can know about Jesus historically depends on a given person's criteria for what they will believe. There are some scholars, certainly the most skeptical fringe element of the scholarly world, who will say if it doesn't come from a non-Christian source, then by definition they won't trust it. So that excludes a priori the four Gospels, and it excludes quite a bit of early Christian testimony, the rest of the New Testament, early 2nd century writers. Even on that very rigid criterion, there are a dozen or more references to Jesus in Jewish and Greek and Roman sources from the earliest centuries, and you can put together a composite picture of Jesus from those sources alone.
There are about 12 extra-biblical, non-Christian sources that say anything from a half a sentence to a paragraph on Jesus. The vast majority date within about 150 years after the death of Jesus, and they report totally about 50 to 60 different items from the life, preaching, death of Jesus, who he was, what happened afterwards, and even the earliest church. So 50 to 60 items
that demonstrate that he was an early 1st century Jewish teacher who was born out of wedlock, whose ministry intersected with that of John the Baptist, who gathered in his adult life close followers, as other self-styled rabbis did, that his teaching regularly came into conflict with conventional teaching of various Jewish leaders, and that he was ultimately arrested and crucified under the governorship in Judea of Pontius Pilate, which narrows the dates to the time period between 26 and 36.
Later, rabbis who didn't believe in Jesus acknowledged that Jesus and his followers did miracles, except they often attributed these to sorcery.
The common early Jewish polemic against the Christian movement was that Jesus was a sorcerer who led Israel astray, which seems to be an acknowledgement that he worked what most people would call miracles. The issue not being did he do spectacular, unexplainable works of mercy, but by what power were they accomplished? Was it from God or was it from the devil?
There are other non-Christian historical sources which contain minimal independent information about Jesus' existence and even confirm aspects of the Gospel accounts. These include references from Thallus, Marabar Serapion, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Celsus, and Lucian of Samosata. Dated around AD 52, Thallus was one of the first secular writers who mentioned Christ. Julius Africanus is one writer who made an offhand reference to Thallus, which may confirm the gospel account that darkness fell upon the land during the crucifixion of Jesus. Sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies in AD 70, a Syrian by the name of Marabar Serapion wrote a letter to his son, a government official, encouraging him to pursue wisdom. Many scholars believe there is a definite reference to Jesus being compared to the philosophers Socrates and Pythagoras within the letter.
He says, remember the Jews who killed their wise king, and the consequence of that was they lost their kingdom. Now, very few people disagree that what he's referring to, given the time of his writing, is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. What's up for debate, potentially, is who's the wise king that would have potentially caused the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. What we suggest is, when you look at, take Josephus and his account of that time and place, it's very difficult to propose who would have been proposed to be a good king who was killed by the Jews, other than Jesus.
Suetonius was a Roman historian, court official under Hadrian, an analyst of the imperial house. He stated in his Life of Claudius that he banished the Jews from Rome, who were continually making disturbances, Chrestus being their leader. This corresponds to the book of Acts in the New Testament, in which Luke recorded the same event of AD 49, as he wrote about the Apostle Paul's relationship with two other Christians named Aquila and Priscilla. Paul met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them. In another work of Suetonius, he wrote about the fire that swept through Rome in AD 64 under the reign of Nero. Writing in about AD 120, he said, "Punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new mischievous superstition."
There were numerous people who, despite being executed in a fashion that the Jewish scriptures said proved somebody was cursed by God, nevertheless, more and more people, Jew and Gentile alike, began to worship him. And one early Roman source describes how people began singing hymns to him as if he were a god.
The non-Christian sources don't shy away from calling him the Son of God or giving these titles, these early titles. They don't even shy away from reporting the resurrection. So some of these sources are pretty surprising in what they admit.
Pliny the Younger was governor of the Roman provinces of Pontus and Bithynia in AD 101 to 110. In a letter to the Emperor Trajan, Pliny the Younger requested specific instructions about the interrogations of Christians whom he was persecuting. He said he made them curse Christ, which a genuine Christian cannot be induced to do. Pliny also notes that Christians worshipped Jesus as if he were a god. This suggests that both Pliny and the Christians he interrogated assumed that Jesus was a historical person.
Part of what we're looking for is existence, trying to give a case, an argument for those who go with a purely mythical Jesus theory and say that there's no evidence really for the existence of Jesus beyond the Christian scriptures. And we think that certainly Thales, certainly Pliny the Younger, Suetonius give us that.